The slap was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence Laura had been writing for years. The sound, a sharp, ugly crack, echoed in the cathedral-like silence of the boardroom. It was a room built for pronouncements of power, for the quiet murmur of billions changing hands, not for the raw, visceral sound of flesh striking flesh. Ethan's head snapped to the side, less from the force of the blow and more from the sheer, concussive shock of it. A faint, crimson bloom began to surface on his cheek, a stark splash of color against the pale canvas of his skin. He didn't touch it. He didn't flinch. He simply stood, his posture unchanged, his gaze shifting from the polished mahogany of the table to the furious, heaving chest of his wife. Laura Sterling stood with her hands still raised, her fingers slightly curled, as if recoiling from the act even as her mind had willed it. Her face, usually a carefully composed mask of ambitious beauty, was contorted with a rage that was both righteous and terrified. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried more weight than a shout in the acoustically perfect space. "How dare you try to undermine me, here, today?" Today was supposed to be her coronation, the culmination of a decade of ruthless ambition, of networking, of sacrificing everything, including, it seemed, any lingering respect for the man she had married, on the altar of success. Before them, spread across the table like a royal decree, was the contract. A thick sheaf of papers that represented the largest, most prestigious project of her career. The development of the new Vance Tower, a skyscraper destined to redefine the city's skyline. Seated around the table were the Titans, her father Robert and brother David, smug and triumphant, their presence a show of familial force. On the other side, Mr. Alistair Vance, the investor, a man whose name was a synonym for monolithic power, his face a mask of inscrutable calm. Next to him, his legal team, sharp-suited men and women who looked like they could weaponize a subordinate clause. They were all witnesses to this ugly, intimate theater. Laura's confidence, however, was absolute. She believed her position unassailable. She saw Ethan not as her husband, but as a stain on her masterpiece, a blemish she had just tried to physically wipe away. She thought this was her moment of triumph. She didn't know it was the precise moment her world began to fracture, the first hairline crack appearing in the foundation of a life built on a lie. Within 60 seconds, the power dynamic in that room would not just shift, it would invert with the gravitational force of a dying star. If you've ever felt the sting of being underestimated, the quiet burn of being dismissed by the very people who should have championed you, then you understand the storm that was gathering behind Ethan's calm eyes. This isn't just a story about a slap. It's a story about the hidden architecture of people's lives. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you believe is the true foundation of respect. Because now, we must go back and see how the blueprints for this disaster were drafted, long before the first shovel ever threatened to break ground. 2 weeks earlier, the humiliation had been a more delicate, creeping thing, served under the guise of a family dinner. The setting was Robert and Laura's childhood home, a sprawling Tudor mansion in the greenest, most affluent suburb of the city. It was a house that declared its wealth with quiet, unshakable confidence, from the ancestral portraits lining the hallway to the weighty silver of the cutlery. For Ethan, it had always felt less like a home and more like a courthouse where he was perpetually on trial. The verdict was always the same: guilty of not being enough. "So, Ethan," Robert began, his voice laced with the buttery condescension he reserved for the staff and his son-in-law. He swirled a deep red vintage in his glass, the gesture and act of casual dominance. "Still playing with your crayons?" David, Laura's brother, snorted into his napkin. He was a softer, less successful copy of his father, his ambition curdled into a permanent sneer. "Dad, they're not crayons. They're, what do you call them, Ethan? Architectural renderings? Doodles of buildings that will never get built." Ethan placed his fork down gently, the tines coming to rest on the porcelain with a soft click. He had been explaining at Laura's strained request a personal project he was working on, a design for a self-sustaining community center. "It's a conceptual design for a competition," he said, his voice even. "It explores new ways of integrating green technology into public spaces." "How noble," David said, his lip curling. "And how much does conceptual design pay these days? Enough to cover your half of the mortgage?" This was the core of their attack, the narrative they had constructed and relentlessly reinforced, that Ethan was a financial drain, a dreamy artist clinging to the coattails of his brilliant, pragmatic wife. The truth was more complex, a thing Ethan had chosen to keep hidden for reasons that were, until recently, rooted in love. He ran a small, independent consulting practice from a home office. To them, this was proof of his failure. He didn't have a corner office, a secretary, or a title they could boast about at the country club. He looked to Laura for support, a familiar and increasingly foolish hope. He saw her at the other end of the long, polished table, a queen in her father's court. She wouldn't meet his eye. Instead, she offered a tight, brittle smile to her father. "Ethan has his passions," she said, the words meant to sound supportive but landing like a dismissal. "But my work is what keeps a roof over our heads. A very nice roof," she added, with a glance around the opulent dining room. The wound wasn't the insult from Robert or David. He had grown calluses over those years ago. The wound was Laura's silent complicity, the way she not only allowed the poison to be served, but implicitly passed him the cup. She saw his quiet, steady work not as a different path, but as a lesser one. His refusal to play the corporate game she excelled at was, in her eyes, a personal affront, a judgment on her own life choices. "Speaking of which," Robert said, leaning forward, the scent of expensive cologne and victory wafting across the table. "Laura's big day, the Vance contract. This is it, the one that puts Sterling Development on the global map." He beamed at his daughter, his pride genuine and suffocating. "And once it's signed, Laura, we need to talk about your domestic overhead." He flicked a piece of lint from his cashmere sweater, his gaze finally settling on Ethan. The implication was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Ethan felt the familiar coil of frustration in his gut, but he compressed it, transformed it into a state of hyper-aware stillness. He reached down and his fingers brushed against the worn leather of the simple portfolio case resting by his chair. It was old, the corners softened with age, the brass clasps dull. To them, it was another symbol of his mediocrity. Inside, however, was a different world. Inside was the truth. It was his symbolic object, a tangible representation of the vast, secret power he held. Touching it was a reminder to himself: patience, strategy. Let them believe what they see. Their blindness was their greatest vulnerability and his greatest weapon. Later that evening, as they drove home in Laura's sleek, pearl-white sedan, a car she often reminded him was a company car, a benefit of her success, the silence was thick with unspoken resentments. "You could have tried a little harder," she finally said, her eyes fixed on the road. "Tried harder at what, Laura? Defending my crayons?" The sarcasm in his voice was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. "At fitting in," she snapped. "At being supportive. They're just trying to look out for me. That contract is everything. You know what's on the line." "I know exactly what's on the line," Ethan said, his voice quiet. He looked out the window, at the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and silver, more than you could possibly imagine. The next day, she presented him with a suit bag. "I bought you something to wear for the signing," she announced, her tone that of a benevolent queen bestowing a gift upon a peasant. "I can't have you showing up in that old tweed thing you call a jacket. First impressions matter, Ethan." He unzipped the bag. Inside was a suit that was perfectly, generically acceptable. It was polyester, a shade of charcoal that was trying too hard to look like wool. It was a suit from a department store, a suit for a man who was an accessory, a plus one. It was an insult tailored to fit him perfectly. "Thank you," he said, his voice betraying nothing. He held the cheap fabric between his fingers. This was not a gift. It was a costume. It was a uniform for the role she had cast him in, the unimportant husband. He would wear it. He would play the part, right up until the final act. He placed the suit bag next to his worn leather portfolio. The contrast was stark. The flimsy garment bag and the solid, history-laden case. One was a lie. The other was the truth. And soon, very soon, everyone would see which was which. Ethan's home office was a space Laura rarely entered. She called it the Hobbit Hole, a small, cramped room off the main living area, cluttered with books, paper, and what she dismissed as trinkets, scale models of impossible buildings, strange geometric solids carved from wood and stone, and framed prints of complex, fractal-like patterns. To her, it was the den of a dreamer, a messy testament to his lack of focus. She never noticed the high-end encrypted server humming quietly in the closet, the enterprise-grade firewall protecting his network, or the three-monitor setup that displayed not games or social media, but complex CAD renderings and structural analysis software that would make a NASA engineer weep. Here, in this unassuming room, Ethan Sterling ceased to exist. Here he was Aethelred Vance. The name was a deliberate choice made years ago. Aethelred, an old Anglo-Saxon name meaning noble counsel, a nod to the integrity he wanted his work to embody. And Vance, a quiet private joke, an appropriation of the name of the most powerful architectural family in the country, a lineage from which he was descended through a forgotten, scandal-plagued branch that his mother had fled. He was, in a strange and distant way, Alistair Vance's cousin, a fact so buried in history that not even Alistair knew it. The pseudonym wasn't just for privacy, it was a mission statement. It allowed him to operate purely on the merit of his work, free from the baggage of family history or the preconceived notions of people like Laura's father. Under the banner of Aethelred Vance, he had founded Elysian Designs, a boutique firm with a radical vision. Elysian didn't have a glittering downtown office. Its employees were a hand-picked team of brilliant misfits scattered across the globe, collaborating digitally on a secure, proprietary platform Ethan himself had designed. They didn't chase every project, they chose them. They were architectural hunters, not farmers, pursuing only projects that pushed the boundaries of design, sustainability, and human-centric engineering. They had won prestigious anonymous awards, their work celebrated in niche architectural journals as the bleeding edge of the craft. Their clients were a select, secretive group of billionaires and forward-thinking corporations who valued substance over spectacle. The Vance Tower project had landed on his virtual desk 6 months ago. It came not from Laura, but directly from Alistair Vance's personal investment fund. Vance was tired of the glass and steel monoliths that prioritized ego over environment. He wanted a legacy. He wanted a building that breathed, that generated more power than it consumed, that actively cleaned the air around it. He wanted a work of art that was also a feat of engineering. He wanted, in short, a building that only Aethelred Vance could design. For months, Ethan had been in direct, encrypted communication with Alistair Vance. They had spoken for hours, not about budgets and timelines, but about philosophy, about the civic responsibility of architecture, about creating a space that could elevate the human spirit. Vance knew him only as Aethelred, a brilliant, reclusive mind with a voice on a secure line and a portfolio that spoke for itself. Ethan had designed the tower from the ground up, a twisting, organic structure wrapped in a skin of photovoltaic cells and algae panels. It was his masterpiece. The irony was a beautiful, painful, intricate structure in itself. While Laura was desperately networking, pulling strings, and preparing her pitch to be the developer for the project, Ethan was the one who held the true power. He was the one who had told Alistair Vance, "The design is contingent on finding a development partner who understands and respects the architectural integrity. They must be a steward, not a conqueror." He had, in effect, created the very job Laura was now killing herself to get. He had even, in a moment of what he now saw as profound marital weakness, subtly guided her. He'd left articles on his screen about sustainable development, mentioned innovations in building materials, planting the very seeds she later presented to her team as her own brilliant insights. He had been secretly helping her win the audition he had arranged. He thought, perhaps naively, that if she won the contract on her own merit, or what she believed was her own merit, it would bring her the security she craved, that she might finally relax, see him, and they could find their way back to the partnership they once had. He had underestimated the corrosive power of her ambition and her family's disdain. Now, sitting in his hobbit hole, he looked at the final contract on his screen. It was not the development contract Laura thought she was signing. This was the master agreement, the one between Vance Investments and Elysian Designs. It named Ethelred Vance as the lead architect in principle of the entire project. It gave him final say authority on all construction, materials, and partnerships. Tucked into a subclause was the provision for a primary development partner, a role Sterling Development was being considered for, but had not yet been awarded. He printed a single page of the agreement, the signature page. He folded it carefully and slid it into the worn leather portfolio alongside the original, hand-drawn conceptual sketches for the tower. He then stood up, walked over to the closet, and took out the cheap charcoal suit Laura had bought for him. He held it up, the flimsy fabric a stark contrast to the monumental weight of the secrets he carried. He would wear her costume. He would play his part. The stage was set. The audience was seated. And the quiet hero, disguised as a fool, was ready for his entrance. The quiet before the storm is not empty. It is full of everything that is about to happen. The day of the signing dawned gray and bruised, the sky over the city a blanket of unwept tears. The air was heavy, charged with the kind of low-pressure stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. It was a perfect mirror for the atmosphere inside Laura's sedan as it sliced through the morning traffic. Laura was a tightly wound coil of manic energy, radiating a high-frequency anxiety that made the car feel small and suffocating. She had been talking non-stop since they left the house, a stream of consciousness monologue that was part battle plan, part pep talk, part veiled critique of Ethan's very existence. "Okay, so when we get there, you let me do the talking. All the talking," she said, glancing at him for a millisecond before her eyes snapped back to the road. "My father and David will be there. They'll handle any of the financial back and forth. Your role is simple. You are my supportive husband. You smile. You nod. You look proud." Ethan stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar cityscape morph into the alienating canyons of the financial district. The buildings grew taller, sleeker, more aggressive, their glass skins reflecting a cold, indifferent sky. "I know how to act in a boardroom, Laura," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to her staccato instructions. "Do you, though?" she shot back, the question not a question at all. "The last time you came to one of my work events, you spent 20 minutes talking to a janitor about the building's HVAC system." "He was the chief facilities engineer," Ethan corrected mildly, "and he had some fascinating insights into retrofitting older buildings for energy efficiency. It was a good conversation." Laura let out an exasperated sigh, a sound he had come to know intimately. It was the sound of her disappointment in him. "Ethan, listen to me. This isn't a university lecture. This is the big leagues. These are not fascinating people. They are powerful people. They don't care about HVAC systems. They care about power and profit and projecting an image of success. So please, for me, just for today, try not to look like you're more interested in the plumbing than the people." She reached over and straightened his tie, her fingers cold and clinical. It was the tie that came with the suit she had bought him. It felt like a leash. And for God's sake, don't mention your consulting. If anyone asks, you're between projects. It sounds better than unemployed. I'm not unemployed, Laura, he said, the words tasting like ash. He was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar, globally recognized design firm, and his wife wanted him to tell people he was between projects. The dramatic irony was so thick he felt he could choke on it. He was giving her one last chance. A small part of him, the part that still remembered the woman he'd fallen in love with, held out a sliver of hope that she would see the absurdity, the cruelty of what she was saying. A glance, a touch, a word of apology, that's all it would take. Instead, she doubled down. We have to project a unified front of success, Ethan. My success for now. This deal, this deal will finally give us the security we need, the freedom. Once it's signed, everything will be different. Yes, it will, he thought. Everything will be different. He settled back into his seat, a profound and heavy calm descending over him. It was the quiet acceptance of an outcome long foretold. The hope he'd harbored had been a flickering candle in a hurricane, and the wind was finally picking up. He was no longer angry. Anger was a hot, reactive emotion. What he felt now was colder, harder, more resolute. It was a feeling of sorrowful clarity. He was a structural engineer of the soul, and he could see the load-bearing walls of his marriage were gone. All that was left was a facade, and today, a wrecking ball of truth was coming for it. As they pulled into the underground garage of the Vance Tower, the existing, older one, soon to be overshadowed by its successor, Laura turned to him, her face a mask of intense seriousness. "Ethan, look at me." He turned. He met her gaze. Her eyes were wide, desperate. "Don't mess this up for me," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, pleading whisper. It was the most honest thing she had said all morning. It was also the most damning. Her plea wasn't, "Don't mess this up for us." It was for me. In her mind, their futures had already diverged. "I won't," he said, and he meant it. He would not mess this up. He would simply let the truth do its work. They rode the silent express elevator to the 60th floor. As the doors opened with a soft chime, they stepped into a reception area of breathtaking austerity. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city, laid out below them like a map. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and money. A severe-looking receptionist led them down a long, art-filled corridor to the boardroom. The door opened and Ethan's quiet before the storm was over. The room was already full of the low hum of conversation. Robert and David stood by the window, chests puffed out. Alistair Vance sat at the head of the table, a silent, gravitational center. And on the table, gleaming under the recessed lighting, was the contract, the fuse. Ethan walked in behind his wife, the man in the cheap suit, the unimportant husband, the silent partner, and felt the weight of the leather portfolio in his hand. It felt like the calm, steady weight of destiny. The boardroom was a stage, and every actor was in place. Laura, radiant and flushed with impending victory, took her seat at the table, positioning herself as the focal point. Her father and brother flanked her like proud, possessive sentinels. Ethan took a seat slightly behind her, as instructed, the designated spot for an appendage. He placed his worn leather portfolio on the floor beside him, a humble offering at the feet of gods he knew to be false. Alistair Vance, a man who looked like he'd been carved from a mountain of granite and good sense, inclined his head. "Mrs. Sterling, gentlemen, thank you for coming. Shall we begin?" His voice was a low rumble, the sound of tectonic plates shifting. The first 20 minutes were a formality, a choreographed dance of legal jargon, as Vance's lawyers walked through the key points of the development contract. Laura nodded intelligently, interjecting with sharp, well-rehearsed comments. She was performing, and she was flawless. Ethan watched her, a distant, academic curiosity replacing all other emotions. He saw the years of Dale Carnegie courses, the Toastmasters meetings, the relentless polishing of her public persona. She had built herself into a perfect corporate instrument. Then, Vance's lead counsel, a woman with eyes that could spot a loophole at 1,000 yards, paused. Section 7, Subclause B, she said, her finger tapping the page. The sourcing of the kinetic dampening composites for the upper third of the superstructure. The specs here provided by your team, Mrs. Sterling, list Titan Core 7 from Aerodyne Industries. That's correct, Laura said, her smile unwavering. The best on the market. We spare no expense. Alistair Vance leaned forward, steepling his fingers. It was the first sign of his direct engagement. My chief architect has raised a concern, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, on Ethan. He notes that while Titan Core 7 has exceptional tensile strength, its performance degrades by almost 40% in environments with high saline content and variable humidity. Given our proximity to the bay and the radical, breathing design of the facade, he believes this could lead to catastrophic material fatigue within 15 years. The room fell silent. Robert and David exchanged a nervous glance. This was an unscripted moment. Laura, however, laughed, a light, dismissive sound. Mr. Vance, I appreciate your architect's diligence, but I can assure you, my engineering team is the best in the business. They have run all the simulations. Titan Core 7 is perfectly adequate. The word adequate hung in the air like a foul odor. Ethan felt a cold dread wash over him, not for himself, not for the impending confrontation, but for the building, his building. He knew that the simulations Laura's team had run were based on standard skyscraper models. They hadn't accounted for the unique microclimate the tower's own biological facade would create. It was a fatal flaw, a ticking time bomb hidden in the building's very bones. He had tried to warn her, embedding notes in the spec files he had leaked to her, but she had clearly dismissed them as the overcautious ramblings of a theoretical architect. He had to say something. It wasn't about her, or him, or their broken marriage anymore. It was about the integrity of the work. It was about the hundreds of lives that would one day occupy that space. He leaned forward, keeping his voice to a whisper meant only for her ears. Laura, he murmured, his voice urgent but quiet. He's right. The saline aerosolization from the algae panels will corrode the polymer matrix. You need the rhodium-infused composite, the R9 series. Laura's head whipped around. Her eyes, which had been shining with triumph, were now narrowed slits of pure fury. She didn't hear the warning. She didn't hear the content. She only heard his voice, cutting into her moment. She saw his intervention not as help, but as a hostile takeover. He was the janitor talking about HVAC systems all over again. He was trying to prove he was smarter than her in front of these people on the most important day of her life. "What did I tell you?" she whispered back, her voice shaking with rage. "Stay quiet. You are not to speak." "This is critical, Laura," he insisted, his voice still low. "It's a safety issue." "You are embarrassing me," she seethed, and then her control snapped. The years of curated resentment, the shame she felt at his perceived failures, the terror that he might expose her as anything less than perfect, it all coalesced into a single, impulsive, violent act. Her hand came up. The motion was a blur. The slap cracked through the sterile air. Silence. Absolute, profound, and devastating. Ethan's head was turned, his cheek already flaming. Her father and brother looked stunned, frozen between outrage on her behalf and horror at the breach of decorum. Vance's legal team stared at their papers, their faces perfect, professional blanks. And Alistair Vance watched. He didn't look shocked. He looked interested, as if a hypothesis had just been proven correct. Laura stood, breathing heavily, her hand tingling. "How dare you?" she repeated, this time louder for the whole room. "How dare you try to undermine me here?" She expected validation. She expected her father to roar, for Vance to dismiss the interruption and get back to business. She expected Ethan to shrink, to apologize, to become invisible. None of that happened. Instead, Alistair Vance slowly, deliberately pushed his chair back. The soft scrape of it on the floor was like a thunderclap. He looked from Laura's furious face to Ethan's calm, marked one. He let the silence stretch, letting her hang in the space she had created. Then he spoke. His voice was not angry. It was quiet. It was precise. It was the voice of a man about to completely and irrevocably change the world. "I believe, Mrs. Sterling," he said, the words dropping like ice cubes into the hot silence, "that your husband was about to save you from a catastrophic, career-ending, and potentially lethal error." He then turned his powerful, undivided attention to the man in the cheap suit. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, reorienting itself around a new center of gravity. "Mr. Sterling," Vance said, his voice now holding a note of profound respect. "Or perhaps, should I say, Aethelred?" He gestured to the empty space on the table, not next to Laura's contract, but at the very head of the table, where his own papers lay. He slid a single, pristine document forward, along with a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen. "Your signature, I believe, is the one we're actually waiting for. As the lead architect, designer, and principal owner of the patent for the Elysian structural system." Laura went pale. It wasn't a gradual loss of color. It was as if a switch had been flipped, draining all life and blood from her face in an instant. The triumphant, furious mask she had worn just seconds before dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow-eyed vacancy. The name, Aethelred, hung in the air, nonsensical and yet terrifyingly familiar. A half-remembered word from a dream that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. "What?" The word was a faint puff of air, devoid of the authority she had commanded all morning. "What is he talking about?" Her gaze flitted from Alistair Vance's unyielding face to Ethan's, searching for a sign that this was a joke, a bizarre, cruel test. But Ethan wasn't looking at her. For the first time since they had entered the room, he seemed to have forgotten her existence entirely. He rose from his chair, not with the hesitant posture of the unimportant husband, but with the fluid, certain grace of a man coming into his own. He walked to the head of the table, the cheap, ill-fitting suit suddenly irrelevant, a mere costume on a king who had chosen to walk among the commoners. He picked up the heavy fountain pen Vance had offered. It felt balanced, correct in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He uncapped it, the motion smooth and practiced, and turned to the document Vance had pushed toward him. It was the master agreement, the one he had reviewed 100 times in his hobbit hole. With a steady hand, he signed his name. Not Ethan Sterling. The script that flowed from the nib was elegant, angular, and utterly confident. Aethelred Vance. The signature sat on the page, a declaration of war and a treaty of peace all in one. It was the truth, finally made manifest in ink. "I don't understand," Robert, Laura's father, blustered from the sideline, his face a confused mess of purple. "What is this nonsense? Aethelred Vance? Who the devil is that?" "Aethelred Vance," Alistair said, his voice calm and clear, "is the single most innovative architect of his generation. He is the founder of Elysian Designs. He is the mind behind the entire project you are so desperate to be a part of. And he is, it appears, the man your daughter just physically assaulted for attempting to save her from gross incompetence." As if for emphasis, Ethan reached down and retrieved the worn leather portfolio from the floor. He placed it on the polished table with a soft, definitive thud. The sound drew every eye. He unfastened the dull brass clasps and opened it. He didn't pull out spreadsheets or reports. He pulled out art. He laid out the original conceptual sketches for the Vance Tower. They were not CAD renderings. They were hand-drawn in charcoal and ink on heavy, cream-colored paper. They were breathtaking. They showed the tower not as a static object, but as a living thing, capturing the play of light on its skin, the flow of air through its atria, the way it would feel to stand within its embrace. They were the soul of the building, and they were signed, in the corner, with a stylized AV. Then he slid out the single, folded page he had printed that morning. He unfolded it and laid it next to Laura's now irrelevant contract. It was the signature page from the master agreement, waiting for his signature. The final piece of the puzzle. Laura stared at the drawings, then at the signature, then at her husband, the man she thought she knew, the man she had dismissed, belittled, and just struck. Her mind, usually so quick and decisive, was a maelstrom of denial and dawning horror. The doodles her brother had mocked, the late nights in the hobbit hole she'd resented, the passions she'd patronized. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a failure to launch. It was a secret, parallel life of staggering success that she had been utterly blind to. "Ethan," she whispered, the name a question, an accusation, and a plea all at once. He finally looked at her. His eyes were not angry. They were not triumphant. They were filled with a vast, aching sorrow. It was the look of a man seeing a stranger where his wife used to be. "My name," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the stunned silence, "is Ethan Athelred Vance Sterling. I kept the two lives separate because I wanted our life, our marriage, to be real, not something propped up by a name or a bank account. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I could provide." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, her father, her brother. "I see now that was a strategic error." The finality of his words, delivered with the cold precision of an architect condemning a faulty structure, was more devastating than the slap had ever been. Laura Sterling, the woman who had everything, realized in that instant that she had nothing at all. The fallout was not an explosion, it was a controlled demolition. Alistair Vance, a master of navigating and creating such moments, nodded to his lead counsel. The sharp-eyed woman stepped forward, her demeanor shifting from passive observer to executioner. "If I may clarify the situation for everyone," she began, her voice cutting through the thick atmosphere of shock. "The agreement on the table before Mrs. Sterling was a preliminary, conditional offer for Sterling Development to act as a junior partner in the construction phase of the Vance Tower project." "Junior partner?" David sputtered, finding his voice at last. "We were to be the primary developers. We have the signed letter of intent." "A letter of intent to negotiate," the lawyer corrected smoothly, without looking at him. "An agreement that was, as per Section 3, Paragraph 2, contingent upon a successful and collaborative final review with the principal architect. That review, I believe we can all agree, has been an abject failure." She turned her attention to Laura, who was still standing, frozen, a statue of shattered pride. Furthermore, the contract contained a standard professional conduct clause. The physical altercation initiated by Mrs. Sterling constitutes a material breach of that clause, rendering the preliminary offer null and void, effective immediately. It was a legal evisceration, delivered without passion or malice. It was simply a statement of fact. Laura's coronation had become her execution. "Now hold on a minute," Robert roared, finally moving from stunned silence to belligerent denial. He was a man used to getting his way through sheer volume and intimidation. "You can't do that. We have invested months, millions in this proposal. We'll sue. We'll take you for everything." Alistair Vance sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Robert," he said, and the use of the first name was a dismissal in itself. "Do you know what a Legion Design standard retainer is for a project of this scale? It's more than your company's entire valuation. Their legal team consists of three of the most feared intellectual property and contract litigators on the planet. Your lawsuit would bankrupt you before the discovery phase was even complete. Please, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself. Robert's face went from purple to a mottled gray. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the dawning, terrifying understanding that he was a minnow threatening a whale. The lawyer continued, turning now to Ethan. Mr. Vance Sterling, as per the master agreement you have just executed, Elysian Designs is now the contracted principal for the project. Clause 11B gives you, as the firm's representative, sole discretion to appoint a new primary development partner, subject to Mr. Vance's approval. The budget and terms remain as negotiated. All eyes turned back to Ethan, the man in the cheap suit, the man who had been a ghost in his own life. He now held the fate of everyone in that room in his hands. Laura's mind finally rebooted. Survival instincts, honed over a decade of corporate warfare, kicked in. The humiliation, the shock, it was all secondary to the immediate, desperate need to salvage the situation. She saw the opening Vance's lawyer had provided. Sole discretion to appoint a new partner. Ethan, she said, her voice now trembling, not with rage, but with a desperate, calculated vulnerability. She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. Ethan, darling, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I was under so much pressure. You know how they are. She cast a quick, venomous glance toward her father and brother. Please, we can fix this. We can do this together. Sterling Vance, a partnership. Your design, my development expertise. It would be perfect. It was a brilliant performance. The swift apology, the blame shifting, the immediate pivot to a new, mutually beneficial future. It was the move of a master strategist. But Ethan had spent years studying her. He knew her plays, her gambits. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperation masquerading as remorse. It wasn't an apology for the years of disrespect, for the constant humiliation, for the slap. It was a business proposal. She was trying to merge with the company she had just tried to destroy. He looked at her outstretched hands, then at her face. He said nothing. He simply turned back to Alistair Vance. Mr. Vance, Ethan said, his voice clear and steady, I would like to formally reject Sterling Development as a potential partner on the grounds of professional incompetence and a fundamental misalignment of values. Each word was a hammer blow, methodically dismantling the last of Laura's desperate hopes. As for a new partner, Ethan continued, I will have my team draw up a list of candidates. I have my eye on a smaller firm, Phoenix Group, led by a young woman named Maria Flores. She's brilliant, hungry, and her company's ethos aligns with ours. I believe they would be a far better steward for this project. Alistair Vance nodded slowly, a small, satisfied smile finally touching his lips. An excellent choice. I've been watching Ms. Flores. She's a rising star. He stood up, extending a hand to Ethan. Welcome aboard, Ethelred. It's a pleasure to finally be working with you in person. As they shook hands, a new alliance forged over the wreckage of the old. Laura finally crumpled. Not just her pride, but her very posture. Her shoulders slumped, her head bowed, and a single, ragged sob escaped her lips. It was the sound of a foundation giving way, of a magnificent structure collapsing in on itself. The weeks that followed were a study in parallel trajectories, one soaring, the other plummeting. Ethan, or rather Ethelred, emerged from the shadows. The story of the reclusive genius architect finally revealing himself became the stuff of industry legend. Trade publications ran breathless profiles. Young architects studied his newly public portfolio with religious reverence. He shed the ill-fitting suit and the timid persona that had been his armor for so long. He moved into the offices of Elysian Designs, a minimalist, light-filled loft space that had served as his firm's ghost headquarters, and took his place as its visible leader. He was decisive, respected, and deeply in his element. The groundbreaking ceremony for what was now officially called the Elysian Tower at Vance Place was a major media event. Ethan stood at the podium, not in a cheap suit, but in a perfectly tailored jacket, his old leather portfolio replaced by a sleek tablet displaying the building's schematics. He spoke with quiet confidence about his vision, about creating architecture that served humanity and the planet. Standing beside him were Alistair Vance and Maria Flores, the dynamic young CEO of Phoenix Group, his chosen development partner. They were a trio that radiated competence and shared purpose. He had not just won, he had built a better team. Meanwhile, Laura's world disintegrated. The story of the disastrous meeting leaked, as such stories always do. First, it was whispers in boardrooms and at cocktail parties. Then it became a blind item in a gossip column. And finally, a full-blown article in a business journal titled "The Sterling Implosion: How Hubris Toppled an Empire." The details were brutal and specific. The arrogance, the technical incompetence, the slap. The slap was the detail everyone remembered. It was the visceral symbol of her downfall. Clients pulled their contracts. Investors called in their loans. Her company, Sterling Development, which had been poised for greatness, was now hemorrhaging money and credibility. Her father, Robert, and brother David were useless. Their blustering and threats had no effect in a world that had already passed judgment. In fact, they made things worse. Their frantic attempts to salvage their reputation only confirming their role in the fiasco. They turned on Laura, blaming her for the public display, for not controlling her emotions, for not being able to handle a simple contract signing. The family unit that had seemed so strong when united against Ethan now fractured under the weight of its own failure, its members turning on each other like sharks in a feeding frenzy. Laura was forced to sell assets, lay off staff she had known for years, and eventually to declare bankruptcy. The pearl-white sedan, the symbol of her success, was repossessed. She had to move out of their spacious, modern apartment, a place she had always considered hers, and into a small, characterless rental in a less fashionable part of town. One evening, about a month after the signing, Ethan came back to the old apartment to collect the last of his things. He had been staying in a hotel, then found a place of his own near his new office. He found Laura there, sitting on the floor in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by boxes. She looked smaller, diminished. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was free of the usual mask of makeup. She looked tired, but for the first time in a long time, she looked real. "I tried to apologize that day," she said, her voice quiet, hoarse. "In the boardroom, it was the wrong apology." Ethan stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He didn't say anything. He just waited. "I was apologizing for getting caught," she continued, her eyes fixed on a crack in the hardwood floor. "For the deal falling apart, I was trying to salvage the business. I wasn't sorry for what I did. Or for everything before." She finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so sorry, Ethan. For the slap, for that dinner, for every time I made you feel small so I could feel big. For not seeing you, for being so blind." This was it, the apology he had once craved, the one he had thought would fix everything. But hearing it now, it didn't bring the satisfaction he might have imagined. It brought only a deep, profound sadness for the years they had lost, for the love that had been eroded by 1,000 tiny cuts and one final, brutal blow. "Why, Laura?" he asked, the question genuine. "Why didn't you see me?" She shook her head, a tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "Because I was so terrified of failing," she whispered. "My father, he raised me to believe that your value is your net worth, that success is something you take, not something you build. You were the opposite. You were patient and quiet, and you built things for the love of building them. It scared me, Your way of being in the world felt like a judgment on mine, so I had to make you small. I had to make you a failure so I wouldn't have to question whether I was the one who was on the wrong path all along. It was the most honest, self-aware thing he had ever heard her say. It was a confession, not a negotiation. For the first time, she wasn't trying to get something from him. She was just telling the truth. The final months of the year passed and the city changed. On the skyline, a new shape began to emerge, the intricate steel skeleton of the Elysian Tower rising with astonishing speed. It was a testament to meticulous planning and harmonious collaboration. On site, Ethan was a figure of quiet authority. He walked the steel beams with the engineers, consulted with Maria Flores and her team, and solved complex logistical problems with an almost Zen-like calm. He was not just building a skyscraper, he was building a community, a culture of respect and innovation. His workers and partners revered him, not because of his famous name, but because he listened. He valued their expertise, and he treated the person cleaning the site with the same dignity as a primary investor. He was building his masterpiece, and he was doing it right. Laura's life was also being rebuilt, but on a vastly different scale. After the bankruptcy, she hit rock bottom. Her father and brother, their own finances in tatters, offered no support, only recriminations. She was alone, stripped of the status, wealth, and identity that had defined her. For weeks, she drifted, lost in a fog of shame and regret. But then, something shifted. Stripped of the need to perform, to impress, to conquer, she was forced to simply be. She took a job. Not a glamorous one. She became an administrative assistant at a small nonprofit that built affordable, sustainable housing. It was humbling work. She answered phones, filed paperwork, and made coffee. Her first paycheck was less than her old monthly expense account for shoes. At first it was torture, but slowly something began to change. She listened to the stories of the families they were helping. She saw the tangible impact of building a home for someone in need. She started paying attention to the architectural plans that came across her desk, not as commodities, but as blueprints for people's lives. She saw the elegance in a design that maximized light and space on a minimal budget, the genius in using reclaimed materials to create something both beautiful and affordable. She began to understand what Ethan had been talking about all those years. She started to see the world through his eyes, not as a ladder to be climbed, but as a structure to be built, with care, integrity, and purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan was reviewing plans in a trailer on the construction site when Maria Flores walked in, a curious look on her face. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she said to tell you, she just wants to show you something." Ethan followed her outside. Standing near the site entrance, holding a simple cardboard tube, was Laura. She was dressed in her simple work clothes, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked nervous, but resolute. She didn't apologize again. She didn't ask for anything. She simply unrolled the document from the tube and held it out to him. It was a blueprint, a simple, elegant design for a two-bedroom family home, designed for a narrow city lot. It was smart, efficient, and full of thoughtful details. A light well to bring sun into the center of the house, a small roof garden, a clever use of built-in storage. It was, in its own small way, perfect. "It's my first one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been taking night classes. I helped the lead designer on this. It's for a family in the East End. We break ground next week." Ethan took the blueprint from her. He studied it, his expert eye taking in the clean lines, the smart solutions. He saw the hours of work, the care, the newfound humility in the design. He saw the influence of his own philosophy, but interpreted through her own, emerging style. He saw the beginning of something new, something she was building, not for status or for money, but for the love of building it. He looked up from the paper and met her eyes. The chasm between them was still there, a vast canyon carved by years of pain and misunderstanding. But for the first time, he saw a bridge, a slender, fragile thing perhaps, but a bridge nonetheless. "It's good work, Laura," he said, and the simple, honest praise was more valuable to her than any multi-million-dollar contract had ever been. "It's very good work." He handed the blueprint back to her. She rolled it up carefully, her hands steady. Their story was not a romance with a guaranteed happy ending. It was a complex, difficult structure that had been condemned and demolished. Now, on the cleared ground, two separate architects were starting to build again. Whether their new foundations would ever align, whether their separate structures would ever become a shared home, was a question only time could answer. But the ground was cleared, the work had begun, and for the first time in a very long time, there was hope. Not for what was, but for what could be built. True worth is not measured by the height of the buildings we are associated with, but by the strength of the foundations we lay in our own lives. It's about integrity, respect, and the quiet courage to build something real, even when no one is watching. Laura had to lose an empire to find her footing, and Ethan had to reveal a kingdom to reclaim his home. What are the blueprints of your life showing?